Ace Team is one of the more interesting players out there in the indie space. The Chilean studio has been around for a surprisingly long time, getting their start with total conversion mods for Doom 2 and Quake 3 back around the turn of the millennium. While I can't claim to have played those, looking at the reference material I could find for them, it seems that even those days of dial-up and WADs, they still had that signature vibe with the high ambitions to match. Perhaps stemming from that modding background, their games always seem to be based on doing something new and interesting with already established concepts, both on a gameplay and thematic level. Even their more mainstream breakout hits follow that formula. Xenoclash is just Final Fight, but in first person, and set in a mystifying and surreal world of steampunk body horror. Rock of Ages is the classic tale of Sisyphus, but expanded into a rolling tour of world and art history told via the medium of Super Monkey Ball. Taking such swings at existing ideas like this and doing them to the nines in the way that Ace is known for is extremely impressive, especially for an indie developer presumably working on an indie budget. It gives Ace as a studio a very B-movie edge. They have wild ambition and lofty ideas that almost certainly outstretch their means, but also the pluck, perseverance, and perhaps pig-headedness to try them anyways. I would guess that's not a comparison lost on the team themselves, considering they made The Deadly Tower of Monsters. A love letter to the world of cheap, mid-century sci-fi serials and creature features. Like all their work, it has some very unique tricks up its sleeve, most notably an ever-present director's commentary, but it's also perhaps their most straightforward game. An earnest celebration of the way those old movies were made, and how and why people enjoy them even decades later. Deadly Tower starts off with you as our intrepid hero, Dick Starspeed, crash landing into the eponymous spire which looms over the alien world of Gravoria. A failed first contact and some fisticuffs later, you're plummeting towards the ground below, only to be saved by that old screenwriter's trick, the unassuming grain silo. From there, you fight your way through the Ape Village situated at the foot of the tower, meeting the persecuted locals who are struggling under the yoke of an evil emperor. At this point, you start climbing the tower, only to be captured by the dread Mega Gorilla, a former Gravorian guardian who's been turned into Imperial muscle. Thankfully, the Emperor's rebellious daughter, Scarlet Nova, leaps in to save Starspeed, and one failed imprisonment later...
Huh? Where is this place? This is not my father's chambers.
You have disobeyed me for the final time, Scarlet. Enjoy an eternity in the Tower of Eternal Solitude. For all eternity!
Ha! The old fool did not notice I am wearing my jetpack.
She joins the party, and you both set off to surmount the Deadly Tower of Monsters.
Good screenwriting 101. Always announce the title within the film itself.
So what is this game exactly? Steam and GOG vaguely call it action-adventure, and Wikipedia calls it a top-down shooter, which is mostly wrong. If I had to pin it down, I would put it somewhere between Brawler and Metroidvania. The core focus is on the basic yet broadly enjoyable action, but there's also a good mix of exploration and very light RPG elements blended in as well. Starting off with the combat, you'll find yourself beating down a whole party city's worth of costume stuntmen, using a plethora of implements that the prop master cobbled together from a Value Village closing sale. There aren't any combos or anything to really worry about, melee and ranged each just use a single button, but there is an adrenaline system where you'll be buffed for a short period of time after landing enough hits. It's a simple but solid enough foundation to build things on, and they don't rest on their laurels either when it comes to that core. There are a ton of enemy types in this game, and not only do they all look different, often evoking specific B-movie cliches and techniques, but each has their own mechanical quirks and different attacks, be it reflecting blaster shots, exploding on death, or spitting out acidic projectiles. They each add their own wrinkle, and ensure there's a lot to be cognizant of in any given encounter, making combat feel varied throughout. Your arsenal also aids in keeping things fresh, with each weapon having its own flavor. Often this is more subtle, but still meaningful, with different weapons adding things like stun chance, homing shots, or some nice chaotic physics to your offense. There's even some differences between how the playable characters will wield the same weapons, with power attacks especially showing some flair. Those per-character changes are ultimately pretty minor, but it's another way that they keep things from stagnating, and it shows how well they considered the feel of their combat. Unfortunately, even with all that variety, it can still feel somewhat mashy and generic at times, especially early on, as the combat in general isn't difficult enough to really demand much of you. Even so, you're provided with some defensive options, though they aren't all that deep or integral. Your primary means of defense is a clunky dodge roll that takes a second to wind up, you get used to that, and packs some decent iframes. In fact, if you do it just right, it will act as a parry to pretty much anything. Handy as that sounds though, I never really used it intentionally, as the timing is very specific, and that mechanic is never actually tutorialized, despite there being a couple of achievements attached to it. There's also some special powers you'll get gradually as you progress up the tower, and they're split across your party, giving each character some additional flavor. These powers are mostly defensive in nature, and will also act as Metroidvania-style not keys for not doors. That said, I also very rarely use these in combat, because they're a tad awkward to deploy and they never really feel needed. For better or worse, the bread and butter combat just works and does so across the whole campaign, so you never really feel like you have to get too creative or skilled as you bash your way up to the top. This is not to say that combat amounts to nothing more than just a mindless corridor of punching bags though. As I said earlier, there's all that enemy variance, and they also change things up with the direction enemies will approach from. Deadly Towers suitably puts a lot of attention towards verticality, and in combat that means you're fighting a war on multiple fronts, dealing with the foes set around you as well as those flying up from below. These secondary threats are generally pretty swiftly settled, as you can peer over the edge at any time and blast away using a gun special made for dealing death on the Y-axis, but they can still surprise you if you're not paying attention. This means that the real fun, if not challenge, of combat often comes from having to manage these two fights, quickly eliminating the threat up top so you can take out some pesky oncoming UFOs before more henchmen spawn in. It's a unique twist on the brawler format and can create some nice tension here and there, though sadly the combat does still end up feeling kind of monotonous by the end of the game. Frankly, that's not really an issue though, as the combat is not what you're here for. So with that in mind, let's put gameplay aside for a second and move on to one of the Deadly Tower's biggest strengths, its presentation. For as much as people love to make fun of the kinds of old movies that Deadly Tower is spoofing, there is an undeniably iconic feel to the way they look and sound. There's the grain and washed out but still oversaturated coloration of old, cheap film stock, the inventive low-budget props and the techniques used to try and hide them, and the ever-present none-too-subtle theremin that infuses the proceedings with grandeur and mystery. The Deadly Tower of Monsters captures all of that, and does so within a different medium, which is an achievement in and of itself. It's not a perfect recreation, of course, but it's still a glorious homage to the silver screen art of making things so bad they're good. Probably the best example of this dedication comes from all those enemies, as that's where they really push some fantastic, recreated old-school practical effects. You've got guys in uncomfortable-looking costumes in both monster and gorilla flavors, pie plate UFOs, animals dressed up as PETA lawsuits, trash can robots, superimposed cartoon animation, and lots of stop motion. That last one is their favorite, and it's used an absolute ton, but to be fair, it's a very impressive effect. I'm not sure how they did it honestly, there's so much of it I wonder if it's the result of a tool they built, but it feels accurate enough that maybe they went old school and just adjusted the rigging frame by frame in order to mimic how Harryhausen did the same thing with clay models. For as lovingly done as the faux stop motion is though, and for as much as I would smile with each old technique referenced, the schlock movie facade does waver at points. There are some key practical and editing effects missing that would really fit the vibe, like bad composite shots, more obvious marionette-style puppets, and really cheap pyrotechnics. Perhaps hitting every B-movie visual cliché like that would have been overindulgent, but there are definitely ways they could have brought more of that flavor in and livened up some key sequences. That said, the sound team clearly didn't get the memo as they were firing on all cylinders throughout. The VO is just as hammy as you could want, and largely manages to imitate the cadence of washed-up D-listers and desperate Hollywood hopefuls chewing the scenery like goats.
Thank you for saving me, strange woman. What is your name?
I am the magnificent Scarlet Nova. Do not question my motives. Just be happy that you are still alive.
The Foley consists of enough classic stock sound effects to make a Ren and Stimpy episode blush, and of course, you will get your Wilhelm scream too. It would be a crime not to include it, but they were smart and it's not overused. And lastly, the soundtrack is top-notch. A mesmerizing journey of ghostly theremin, whirling flutes, booming brass, and plodding, ponderous drums. All these staples of classic, over-the-top schlock musical scores are present and used perfectly in each track. In fact, I would say this is the one place where their dedication to recreating the low-budget experience actually acts as a detriment. The default sound option for this game is VHS, which crushes things down and gives it that scratchy, warbly, barely holding together, kinda melted in the sun a little bit rental store tape feel, which, while great for authenticity's sake, does drown out a lot of the nuance and depth of the soundtrack. Thankfully, you can set it to DVD instead, same for the visuals, which removes the film grain, and get the full experience. You, of course, could also just listen to the soundtrack on its own. They were nice enough to include it free in the Steam release, and it's on Spotify. Moving along though, let's get back to the plot and continue to scale the Deadly Tower of Monsters. I'm having way too much fun with this. Anyways, we left off scaling our way up the first bit of the tower, dealing with evil apes, squidmen, random oozes, legally distinct beholders, and other nonsense along the way. Most importantly though, we've since found the disembodied but still functioning head of Dick's faithful navigator, Robot. From there, we collect some mines we can use to unlock the way forward, as well as go back to the foot of the tower and take down the nuclear ant hive. It's here we find the rest of Robot's body, and none too soon, as the Queen Ant immediately comes along and captures Dick. Again, we gotta get our money's worth out of that dummy, goddammit. That's fine though, because Robot quickly puts itself back together and gets to work, exterminating its way across the colony and rescuing Starspeed in a surprisingly easy battle versus one of the game's very few mini-bosses. Now with Dick, Scarlet, and Robot all together, our party is finally complete, and we're ready to go take on the Emperor. But first, we have to get past the Mega Gorilla. The Mega Gorilla is our first proper boss fight, and still wonderfully animated in that faux stop-motion style. The fight starts off with a further climb up the tower as he gives chase, with you avoiding or dispatching enemies along the way. It's really more of a race than a chase, actually, as the Mega Gorilla doesn't seem all that interested in you, and will happily keep climbing, but he has some sort of death field attached to his ass that will hurt you if you fall behind. This is then followed up by a more traditional fight after we come to a ledge that provides some more room to maneuver. It's not the most engrossing encounter in the world. It's a very simple avoid the shockwaves affair as you wail on his big rubbery mitts and fend off his goons. Neither phase of this boss fight is all that fun, to be honest. Both are very simple and have their own annoying quirks, but at the very least, it ends well. Once the Mega Gorilla has been defeated, he plummets off the tower and you fall off with him, blasting at him the whole way down, and it's extremely satisfying thanks to the sense of momentum present in the big, almighty With the Primate Primarch lying dead in the drink, we finish off part 1 and continue our way up to the next part of the tower. As we leave the stony surroundings of the temple area, we move on to the gilded, almost Art Deco pathways of what I can only assume is supposed to be the Emperor's main base. I absolutely love the look of this area. The deep red pathways, all the gold, the menacing, angular statue work and decoration. It just feels, I don't know, classy? Sure, classy. Dated, but classy. The first thing we're greeted with here is a private conversation, for some reason being broadcast on a bunch of triangular CCTV monitors, between the Emperor and his top cohort, Dr. Peculiar. You'll hear these two bicker back and forth occasionally throughout the level, establishing that archetypal aggrieved underling dynamic that's surely not them foreshadowing things for later in the movie. Game. Whatever. Anyways, the topic of discussion is putting the finishing touches on the imposing Mechameleon, which you'll see clinging to the side of the building. I do always appreciate when a game sets up the big boss for a section or a chapter like this ahead of time. When done right, it's a fantastic way of building anticipation and giving the players some direction and motivation. Speaking of helping players along, let's get back to some of those gameplay nuts and bolts and talk about how forgiving this game is. And I mean that in the best possible way. The gameplay, and especially the platforming, can be kinda clunky at times. A large part of this is due to the isometric perspective. It's always been kind of a weird fit for platforming. But there's also a minor stiffness to the controls that doesn't help, and a distinct sense of jank present. You'll get your fair share of moments where you'll judder weirdly if you land a jump wrong, or you'll get fucked by the geometry and slide off things. But rather than try to hide this by putting in a bunch of invisible walls or locking the experience down, Ace Team has added a number of mechanics to help mitigate those issues and even make them work for you. First off, there's a handy air teleport that lets you recover whenever you fall, or jump, off the tower, quickly zipping you back to the last piece of firm land you were on. Additionally, you get a relatively generous jetpack that lets you correct your jumps when the isometric camera or some poor geometry gets in your way. It also enables you to land safely from quite literally any height. If you do manage to get yourself stuck, you can also teleport to any checkpoint you've reached in the game at any time you like, easily unsticking yourself as well as allowing you to roam for secrets with impunity. Between these three things, any real punishment for exploring or testing the limits of the environment and where you can go is removed, providing an incredible sense of freedom. This degree of forgiveness even extends to the combat, as you are beefy in this game. You have a pretty sizable health pool, and at least in the early game, health pickups are pretty common. This gives you a lot of room to play around with different weapons and special powers, as well as take your time enjoying the monsters and their designs. While this does also contribute to the combat feeling a bit stale by the end, and it won't stop you from eventually settling on a preferred set of weapons, it still ends up making a lot of the combat feel more enjoyable. There's only one consequence in this game that I would call punishing or unpleasant in really any sense, and that's the penalty for dying. In all likelihood, it won't happen to you very often for all the reasons we've just gone over, but when you do die because you forgot to jetpack out of a long fall or something, you'll get reset back to your last checkpoint, with the world reset back to that point as well. This means every collectible you've picked up will be put back, and you'll have to sit through any commentary lines or cutscenes for a second time. While this game does manage to be pretty funny, obviously that wears away when you have to re-listen to jokes. More importantly though, this game is packed to the rafters with secrets to find, some quite out of the way where you'll need to push the limits of the platforming to get there, and picking one of those up and then dying can be a real bummer. It's not the end of the world, of course, it just means you need to be more judicious about hitting checkpoints whenever you can, but it's still annoying when it happens. Those collectibles I just mentioned are important too. Extremely important, in fact, because the Deadly Tower of Monsters has tied basically its entire progression system to how much you explore around and pick up the random doodads strewn about for you. The most common thing you'll find are blue, silver, and gold cogs that you'll use to upgrade your weapons. Blue ones will drop from enemies here and there, but the silver and gold ones can only be found in the environment, and the gold ones are often very well hidden or tricky to reach. While there's lots of cogs to find, they're not so abundant that you'll ever be able to fully upgrade all of your weapons, so you'll want to search high and low for them as well as be pretty choosy regarding what you upgrade. Outside of those cogs, there are also gold hoops to fall through, special targets to shoot, missing film reels to collect, and extras in monkey suits wearing wristwatches that need to be removed for continuity's sake. Finding all of this miscellanea, as well as reaching secret places and doing specific things in combat, will unlock achievements. Duh. But achievements are what gate leveling up in this game. For each one you get, you'll get another level, and a useful passive stat increase. While I can see some people not loving that idea, it does admittedly feel a little inorganic for lack of a better word, tying exploration and experimentation directly to your effectiveness like this really does provide a satisfying sense of progression. The fact that it mirrors your ascent up the tower, as what you can actually reach will open up as you climb, makes it feel even better. On that note, they also really bank off the big honkin' tower concept with how they've placed a lot of the secrets and collectibles. For example, you'll see those hoops and targets I mentioned as you head up the tower, but be unable to get to them right away. meaning you have to keep them in the back of your mind until you're higher up and can drop down to them. Thanks to the backtracking being so simple and forgiving with all the teleporting and jetpacking, this ends up becoming a really fun facet of the gameplay. You'll be hurling yourself off the side constantly looking for goodies you could swear were just a few yards below you, or a little to the left or a little to the right, constantly trying to correct. This culminates in the little islands you'll see dotting the ocean that stretches out from the tower's base. These generally contain a gold cog, a fun Easter egg, and an achievement, and getting to them will require several separate, exceedingly long plunges off the tower as you try to find the right height where your jump arc will give you just enough distance to reach. These moments really stick out in my mind, as not only do they perfectly drive home just how far up you're climbing, but they have a real Skyrim-y, see that ghost ship? You can fall to it energy, making places you would otherwise mistake for set dressing feel more tangible. Sadly, all of this fantastically well-driven exploration and discovery is somewhat deflated when you realize you don't really need to do much of it to actually beat the game. As we've discussed, it is on the easy side. This is only emboldened by the fact that Deadly Tower has a currency which is, for all intents and purposes, completely worthless. Most enemies and random objects will drop gold when destroyed. This is actually contextualized in the story too, which I kinda love. And you'll theoretically want to save it up, as you'll need to spend it, along with those cogs and achievements mentioned earlier, on upgrades and level ups. However, you'll have so much gold on you before you reach even one of those upgrade stations that you likely won't even notice it needs gold. As long as you make sure to pick up the gold dropped by enemies and destroy every pot and random object you come across, something I do and I'm sure you do in a game like this out of muscle memory and sheer instinct if nothing else, you'll never not have enough gold to buy everything you can at any given time and by a sizable margin. Ultimately, this is a minor thing, as you're still corralled in by the other stuff you need to get. But between that and the overall lack of challenge, it can dampen your motivation to go off the beaten path at times. Especially if you just want to get on with the story, which, thinking about it, is something we should be doing. Where the hell did we leave off? Oh yes, the Mechameleon! Alright, I'll stop that now. It's starting to hurt my throat anyways. So, we start heading back up the tower, as does the Mechameleon, pushing our way through the Emperor's guards, with some highlights being these big phantom creeps looking bastards, the aforementioned animal rights violations, and these old broken vacuums. Once we get to the top of the section, we're greeted with a rocket we can't use yet and a meeting with the Emperor himself. This game is sadly light on overlong villain monologues, but thankfully things get a needed injection of cheese here as you learn his evil plan. To put it simply, Dominion is but a means to an end, and the enslavement of the Gravorians is nothing but a facade. He's working them to death or just outright hunting them down, because when creatures die on Gravoria, their bodies dissolve into pure gold due to the planet's unique radiation. Gravoria is nothing but a simple fundraising venture to fuel his conquest of the galaxy. With his general shittiness established, the Emperor then takes off on his flying throne, so you can get on with that boss fight that's been looming since the start of the chapter. The Mechameleon follows much the same pattern as the Mega Gorilla, an extended chase sequence that's then followed up by a proper boss fight and a plummet down to Earth. The chase sequence is a bit more engaging this time around, with some light puzzles and proper combat involved. It also moves at your own pace, with the Mechameleon stopping to swipe at you here and there, rather than just continuing to climb. The proper fight at the end is shorter and less involved than the Mega Gorilla one though. There's no extra goons or stage hazards, it's just a good old-fashioned avoid the animations and wail on the weak spot affair. Do that the requisite number of times and the Mechameleon will fall off the tower, once again bringing you down with it, crashing into the Dino Dome and opening up that chunk of the map. From here, we get another bit of dialogue between the Emperor and Dr. Peculiar before we get to plow through this prehistoric preserve, destroying the good doctor's work in the process and getting some more of that awesome stop motion. With the beasties culled, we then gain the chain lightning power for Robot, which allows us to go start up that conspicuous rocket from earlier and move on to the next chunk of the tower. With that, we arrive at the laboratory of Dr. Peculiar, whose domain has a very 1960s Bond villain aesthetic to it. There's a lot of cold steel, sloping angles, and industrial concrete compared to the previous area's more lavish surroundings. It all feels very functional, which is fitting, but less interesting to look at in my mind. As we start making our way through the base, we run into Dr. Peculiar's former assistant and an overt homage to the Fly, Dr. Schoppenstein. He lets us in on how Dr. Peculiar has stolen his research in order to build an army of clones, and asks us to take out the master cloning machine. Almost immediately after this, you meet up with Peculiar himself, who reveals the larger scope of his treachery, and that he has been actually funneling funds from the Emperor for his own evil plans. In order to keep the pace off, he then fucks off and leaves you to play with his army of atomic monkeys and other discarded diabolical science experiments. Let's leave the party to their business for the moment though, and finally address the absolute best part of this game. I mentioned near the start of the review that the entirety of the Deadly Tower of Monsters is underscored by a running director's commentary, specifically that of Dan Smith, the director of the movie. It's this aspect of the game that really sets it apart, but moreover, it shows how well Ace Team understands and loves the genre of film they're spoofing. The essence of a really enjoyable schlock masterpiece often comes from how seriously it takes itself, and the lack of irony from those involved. It's both what makes these films funny in a guilty, schadenfreude kind of way, but also so endearing and appealing on a human level. That passionate, genuine approach is something that's incredibly hard to fake, which is why a lot of modern, intentional takes on the so bad it's good movie often come off as hokey and lame. That magic of seeing something nonsensical or downright silly being treated by those involved as a serious work of fiction is lost when that fourth wall breaks and you start seeing winks and nudges showing, hey, we're in on the joke. This all goes double when it comes to modern attempts to satirize the genre rather than pay homage. Satire is hard enough with an appropriate target, but in this case, you're dealing with movies that have inherently goofy premises, shoestring budgets, and casts that are often inexperienced or over the hill. The subject matter is already a joke in and of itself, and it has that underdog energy as well. Viciously making fun of it is the equivalent of mocking a clown, and also kicking a puppy at the same time. A clown puppy. Making you the asshole. You monster. Where was I keep getting off track. Oh, right, the commentary. So, by having this abstraction layer, essentially, between the subject matter and their jokes about the subject matter still being expressed with a faux seriousness through Dan, they avoid the problem entirely. Dan can spit out lines about how bad the acting is, or how they clearly cut corners, or how those trees are plastic, or whatever, without ruining the genuine air that the movie has, regardless of how cheesy it gets. It shows a respect to the material, or in this case, a respect to the genre as a whole. Also, as a side benefit, Dan's repartee and how it's delivered also helps mimic that very comfortable, shit-talking way that a lot of people watch these movies. Hanging out with friends, yelling at the screen, and questioning how in the hell what they're watching got made. I have more to say about the commentary, and more specifically about the man himself, Dan Smith, but that's going to require me to start spoiling jokes. As we're near the story's zenith anyways, this seems like as good a time as any for spoiler warning. If you're wanting to keep a slice of this grade A cheese fresh for your own playthrough, jump to the following timecode. Otherwise, stick with me as I cover the duality of Dan. What makes Dan's commentary really interesting is the added conceit that he is the creator of the movie, and how that reflects upon him and his overall character. More than perhaps anything else in Deadly Tower, Dan feels like a very direct parody of mid-century, low-budget Hollywood cliches. He's one part Ed Wood, one part Roger Corman, and one part Satan. But like, dollar store Satan. Stan. He's multifaceted is what I'm saying, and there's no better way to showcase this than through his own words. Dan is ignorantly self-righteous.
Well, this was groundbreaking. We had the woman rescuing the man for once. We were really ahead of our time with this scene, but then again, I've always been rather progressive. The studio exec didn't seem to get why it was such a big deal, though. Sorry, we don't see this as anything unusual. Ha! Of course! It's unusual! A woman would never save the man. It just doesn't happen. Not in the movies, not in real life. I don't know why we didn't get more recognition for this scene. Well, I guess I was just a little too ahead of my time.
Flippantly callous.
Funny story about the two caged apes in this scene. I had completely forgotten about them when we wrapped up filming on the set. Then we spent the next day doing a location shoot. So, suffice it to say, our return to the studio was met with a couple of grumbling tummies complaining about unsafe work conditions, human rights, yada yada yada.
Utterly oblivious.
Ah, yes, the infamous ghost ship and its ape captain. A lot of critics and moviegoers were just befuddled at its inclusion in the film. Those people, they just don't understand symbolism and subtext. I guess that's to be expected when you're making a fun sci-fi movie and you try to inject some high-level intellectualism, smartness. Well, whatever the word is. Why did I even bother?
Washed up and pathetic.
Some of you might feel sorry for our castaway ape friend here. But why? He's living the dream. Got his own personal island all to himself. I was hoping I could buy my own island after releasing this film, but sadly my expectations of success fell a little short. After that first opening weekend, I was only able to afford renting out the living room at my sister's place. But hey, I had my own personal cabinet space on their kitchen island. That's something.
Genuinely lonely.
Hey Patrick, I was thinking we should take a little break and get a bite to eat. You like Chinese? I know a great takeout.
Well, we're not scheduled for a break for another few hours.
Nonsense. Hey, you have to try the shrimp. It's the absolute best. But, oh, hey, I feel like I should warn you. It gives me horrible gas. But that's okay. We're friends, right?
Really, sir. Studio time costs a fortune. Let's just stay on schedule.
Good thinking. We can grab a real dinner together and go out for a night on the town. Yeah. Two young bachelors on the prowl. Say, where do you youngsters go these days?
Appreciative of the movie's fans.
You know, this movie may not have made the big splash in Hollywood or even made the budget back for that matter, but hey, in the end, I think it was still worth making just for those die-hard fans that really love it. I attended a lot of sci-fi and movie cons, and to this day, I still see fans showing up dressed as aliens and apes and dinosaurs. Does a man proud. Now, granted, their costumes aren't exactly 100% faithful to the film, and it seems that no one ever remembers them by the right name. But still, knowing that we still have fans like this promoting the film decades later, it puts a tear in this old director's eye. I get all emotional. Okay.
And of its crew's hard work.
Do you have any idea what sort of blood, sweat, and tears went into creating this army and making them all move around on cue? No, seriously, do you? Because I'm still stumped by this. I watch the scenes and I just, flabbergasted by the amount of work someone must have done to make all this happen.
It's easy to dislike Dan. In many ways that's the intent, but he does also come off as very human and surprisingly sympathetic. You feel bad that he's clearly way past his prime and that his prime wasn't that great to begin with. At the same time, you also can't help but hate his arrogance and clear cruelty masquerading as kindness. He also has a distinct charisma, creating that feeling that even though you know he's chock full to the brim with shit, he truly and completely believes every word of it. And the fact that he believes it is almost enough to forgive him for it in the first place. We've all known someone like Dan. Whether they were a shitty boss, or an egotistical high school acquaintance, or a coworker who won't shut up about their amazing fucking side hustle. You've met Dan, or even been Dan at various points in your life. That's what makes him both extremely relatable, but also the perfect villain, which is essentially what he's written as here. This game is ultimately a character study of Dan Smith, and a subtle dissection of the misguided directors and producers that inspired his character, and who can often be just as bizarrely fascinating as the movies they make, case in point.
You're scary.
You are lying, I never hit you! You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
Sadly though, despite being the game's most interesting aspect, Dan doesn't stick around forever. And with that, let's get back to the plot itself and continue to climb the tower. We keep on with our pursuit of Dr. Peculiar, working our way through his various science projects as we head further up the tower. There's a lot of nice set pieces on display here, like dashing down a river of asteroids and clambering around on satellites. You'll also square off with some tougher enemies, like these Cyclopean robots with very limited hurt windows, and of course the master cloning machine Dr. Schoppenstein asked us to destroy earlier. At the end of it all though, we run back into the good doctor. Scarlet reveals she's transmitted his treachery from earlier back to her father, the Emperor, who promptly shows up to put his lackey in place. But in a shocking plot twist, Peculiar is prepared for this and has an everything-proof shield, really, equipped and ready to go, neutralizing the Emperor's attack. The Emperor is then promptly put down by Peculiar's giant mutant octopus, upon which he has fastened the weak points of his energy shield for some reason. Cue a boss fight as we take on both the Doctor and his pet. This fight breaks from the pattern of the last two, with the chase and fight being combined and with you being the one doing the chasing this time. Our goal is to hit each of the 8 energy rings on the octopus's arms to disable Peculiar's shield, at which point he'll flee up to the next level of the tower so you can do it again. This is even easier than it sounds, as the splash on your rocket launcher is generous enough to let you hit 2 rings at once most of the time. We repeat this process twice, deal with a short elevator survival section, and then we get to the top of the tower. There we blow up a few mines and send the tentacled terror hurtling back down to where we started the fight, where it explodes upon impact. With his shield gone, Peculiar is left with no defense, and is swiftly dispatched.
Tut tut! Did you really think I wouldn't have another deadly trap prepared?
The villain defeated, the tower climbed, our heroes reflect on a job well done as the movie ends and the credits start to roll. Anytime now.
And about now, we should be seeing the ending title card, the credits, and all the usual fanfare and the music. Hey, let's not forget, hold up. That's not right. Part 4?
Huh. Part 4, eh? Somehow the movie keeps going, despite Dan being very sure that he never filmed nor wrote a 4th chapter. He runs off to go make some phone calls and figure out what's going on, leaving the sound engineer, Patrick, to provide the rest of the commentary. Losing Dan's narration is a blow, to be honest, and it makes this one of the weaker parts of the game, though thankfully also one of the shortest, but we'll get to that in a second. First, let's talk about what's actually happening here. Our party is approached by the true Gregorians. It turns out those actors in ape suits were not the natives of this planet, but rather it's these little green dudes. They want our help to fully stop the Emperor, as their extinction at his hands has apparently been prophesized, and we must climb up their really cool, trippy-looking red and black space station to help. This is also where things take an interesting and very direct look at the 4th wall, with that abstraction layer I mentioned earlier slowly being pierced. It starts with Dan running off, of course, but then more elements of the filmmaking filter into the movie, and are recognized by our heroes who stubbornly seem to remain in character. They're provided with scissors that are said to disrupt flight, a sneaky reference to everything being held up by wires, a list of forbidden words that are just swears they can't say due to the movie's rating, and eventually they're just handed the damn script in its entirety. This sort of turn in the story can end up feeling desperate and almost masturbatory if unearned, but it actually works here. This is both because of the long build-up to this chapter, letting us establish some actual expectations for them to subvert, and because while they may be breaking the 4th wall of the movie, they never break the fourth wall of the game itself. So like the fifth wall, I guess. Regardless, what I'm saying is that they never pull you out of the experience with this. In fact, the only thing that disrupts the illusion at all for me at this point is the still running commentary provided by Patrick, with him expressing a cynical disbelief in what's going on and lambasting the movie as a whole. Well, I get the purpose of this, as losing that aspect of a constant dialogue entirely in this last chapter would be weird. Compared to Dan, Patrick just kinda sucks. Not only does he have less to say than Dan, but he's less interesting overall, coming off as a typical, disaffected 20-something who hates his job, very much intended to be a player insert. His remarks largely break down to chuckling over the poor pacing of this chapter and how cheap and cliched the enemies are. His banter does still have that comfortable yelling at the screen with friends feeling I mentioned earlier. In fact, it probably hits that better than Dan's industry talk did, but it's comparatively lacking in charm as Patrick just doesn't really have much of a character himself. It's not worth dwelling on though, as Deadly Tower rapidly speeds towards a conclusion so it can shoot its load and have one last big twist. You reach the top of the station and are shown a mirror, where you look behind yourself and see Dan, back when he was directing the film. With the fourth wall now fully shattered, you read the script and face off with the Emperor as you were always predestined to do. You start off by having a short fist fight with him. It's a relatively simple fight with you avoiding shockwaves and then ducking in for a few hits. He'll eventually spawn some hollow clones, which will turn on the heat some, but it's all still over in just a few minutes. At this point, he hops onto his throne ship where you have to deal with his infinitely spawning grunts and big stompy robot hands. It's an unwinnable fight. You'll never beat the Emperor, which is fine, because he's not the enemy. Dan is. The mirror from earlier comes down, showing you the filming taking place off-screen, allowing you to jump off the set and smack Dan around for having the sheer temerity for daring to try and do his job. Do this 3 times and you've won. You take Dan hostage, have him rewrite the script with a new sappy, saccharine ending, the credits roll, and everyone lives happily ever after. There's even a good conversation during the credits as Patrick calls his boss to confirm that things are a wrap, where you find out that Dan is now missing. He never came back from making those calls, which leaves the true nature of the Deadly Tower of Monsters a mystery, just as it should be. Well, I ultimately find this ending to be kinda limp and unsatisfying, to be honest. Dan showing up as the big bad is a very fun twist, and I genuinely like the Twilight Zone-esque questions left hanging at the end. To be honest, that's what you're left with when the credits roll on most cheaply written B-movies anyways, so it just acts as another fitting, subtle reference to the subject matter if nothing else. There are a few things in this game I didn't touch upon that are worth mentioning, though they're definitely more along the lines of bonus features on the DVD than proper content. The first is a simple wave-based survival mode, which is exactly what it says on the tin. You take on increasingly difficult waves of monsters in an arena with constantly shifting hazards. After each wave, you can spend the gold you've earned on new weapons, powers, upgrades, or health, with the goal being to make it as far as you can before dying. It's super basic and not all that fun, because as we've discussed, there isn't a ton of depth to the combat. It is challenging at the very least though, as you don't have all those level up perks to beef you up, and the amount of gold you have to work with between stages is very slim. It's an appreciated addition, and it's nice to see them try to do something with the mechanics, but it's ultimately nothing more than a momentary distraction. There's also a hard mode you can toggle on, but for the life of me I'm not sure what it actually does. I played through the opening section, up to the first appearance of the Mega Gorilla with it on, and saw no difference between that and normal when comparing my footage. There was the same enemy placements, same items, and enemies took just as long to kill. Perhaps the enemies do more damage, or maybe it just doesn't ramp up on art until you get further in. It's hard to tell. Like with the survival mode though, the combat isn't so engaging or even really core to what's enjoyable about the Deadly Tower of Monsters that bumping up the difficulty feels worthwhile. To be fair though, that hard mode is really only there to help make the game's 4-player co-op more viable. You can play locally with friends, or over Steam Remote Play I suppose, and go through the entire campaign that way. The developers have said the game was in tune with this in mind though, so hard mode is there to stop you from steamrolling the game too thoroughly. Still, the value there is in fooling around with a few buddies, which, well, not for me, is always a nice option to have. If those additions sound a little undercooked and slapped together, that's because they weren't actually part of the game at launch. All three of those things, along with including the soundtrack in the game's files, were added for free by Ace Team after the fact. On PC at least. I'm not sure if those extras ever made it to consoles. That level of dedication and generosity should be lauded, as each one of those features could have very easily been parceled out as DLC. Looking through the Steam forums and the news updates for this game, it's clear they put a ton of support behind Deadly Tower, with regular updates and giveaways and all sorts of fun stuff, which is something I can't help but cheer on. While the Deadly Tower of Monsters may not be Ace Team's most bizarre, or honestly even their most fun to play game, I still think it's my favorite thing they've made. It captures a very specific feeling around a topic I have a great fondness for, and does so with a careful balance of humor and respect. This game clearly comes from a place of love, and I think that even if you don't share that enjoyment of schlock cinema, that passion shines through. Also, while the B-movie angle may be the core hook here, there's enough creativity on display in almost every other facet to still make it well worth picking up and sinking an afternoon into if those kinds of movies aren't your cup of tea. And it will be just an afternoon, as this game is quite short. My playthrough for this video only took 4.5 hours, and a large chunk of that was me hurling myself off the tower looking for secrets. But that means it doesn't overstay its welcome. It makes Deadly Tower's flaws that much easier to forgive and lets you enjoy it as the simple, cheesy adventure that it was designed to be. And that is the Deadly Tower of Monsters all wrapped up. An absolutely fantastic game, which honestly made it really hard to write about, but worth doing all the same. It was great getting to go back to it, as I hadn't played it since launch, and in that time I've personally gotten deeper and deeper into watching B-movies on the regular, so I was able to appreciate it a lot more the second time around. Speaking of, if you're wondering how you yourself might go watch the sorts of schlock that inspired this game and that I use clips of throughout the review, then I'd recommend using a service called Tubi. It has a vast library of public domain and otherwise dirt cheap to license garbage to enjoy, and aside from the odd ad break, it's totally free. It's especially fun if you're a fan of Red Letter Media, as they seem to have almost every movie they've ever watched on Best of the Worst on there. Alternatively, you can also just go the open source route and check out archive.org, as their video section has a ton of great older flicks that have since fallen into the public domain, along with other weird ephemeral nonsense if you're in the mood to watch educational films from the 50s, which I generally am, honestly. Anyways, for those disappointed this wasn't a more funny review, with me mercilessly ripping down another 7th gen lump of mediocrity, we'll get back to that next time. I'm already working on the next video, and the game in question is special. Let's just put it that way. I hope to have that video up quicker than this one, but I'm not making any promises. Until then though, have a good one, and thanks for watching.